how we can choose the thread of our story that we want to follow, because we're all of us people of a certain age, and telling 75 years in 20 minutes is daunting. So first of all, I'm going to light the chalice and read an opening reading, because the chalice signifies that we are in our very own kind of church. And the opening reading is a poem by Joy Harjo called Eagle Poem. She says, to pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to see to one whole voice that is you, and know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound, but others circles of motion, like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born, and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning inside us. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. So here's the first way I can tell my story, with loss as the thread, because there have been a lot of losses in my life, and there have been times when it felt like that's all there was. So I was born in December of 1944. My father was away in the Second World War in the Philippines. So my mother was living with her mother, and the two of them cared for me until the fall of 1945, when my father came home from the war. A year and a half after that, that grandmother died. I was 2, and she had been an incredibly important part of my life. My younger brother was born a week after my grandmother died. And then a year after that, my father died. My mother says she doesn't remember. She told me when she didn't remember that entire year, because she just lost the people she was most close to. Then when I was 12, my other grandmother died, my father's mother, who had always told me she had waited 17 years for me because she really wanted a granddaughter, and she loved me unconditionally in the way all of us should be loved. And I had an older cousin who was a boy, who was 17 when I was born. So I had this amazing sense of being completely loved, and then she died. So then life went on, and I went to high school and I went to college, and I got pregnant while I was in college, and I had to give the baby up for adoption because that's what you did in the 60s. Middle-class girls were hidden away, and it was the hardest thing I ever did in my life, was to give that baby up for adoption, because I knew that I loved her, and they told me that it would be best for her, that she would have a good family who could take care of her, and that I couldn't take care of her. So I did that, went depressed for weeks, months, years. I went back to school, but I really felt lost. And I was sitting in a psychology class with a friend of mine, and she said, so I'm in this project called Volunteer Teachers for Africa, and there were a couple of guys who were supposed to go teach next year, and they can't go because it's the Vietnam War and they'll get drafted if they leave school. do you want to go to Tanzania for a year? And I said, sure, why not? Because what else was I going to do at that point? So I went to Tanzania for a year, taught English, came back, finished college, met the man that I would eventually marry my last semester in college. And he and I moved to Santa Fe after I had been to graduate school, and we got married and had our son. But when my son was a baby, it became clear that my husband was not mentally sound. He actually was diagnosed as schizophrenic. And it was clear that he was never going to be able to keep a job and take care of us. So I left because I couldn't deal with his strangeness. And then eventually, and I was really poor. I had a little nursery school that was great, but I never made any money. And my son was incredibly smart. And so I decided that I had to leave Santa Fe, where I couldn't make a living, and move to St. Louis because my brother was living there. And I went to Washington University to get an MBA. But then my brother moved back to New York, leaving me alone in St. Louis. So I got my MBA, I went to work for Citigroup. They moved me to Rochester, and I was delighted to be here because my family are more or less close to here. We have a summer cottage up north of here, which I've talked about a gazillion times, but and I was up at the lake with my son and my mother and my stepfather, and my mother died of a heart attack. It was totally unexpected to me. I knew that she was in trouble, but she walked down the stairs clutching her chest, and we had to call the ambulance, and it was catastrophic and incredibly sad. So I came home from that, and Bob and I had started dating, but he was away on a trip. And when he came back a few weeks later, I told him the whole hard story of my mother dying. And we got closer and closer. It took us some time. And the following summer, he rode his bike across the country, and then he asked me to marry him when he got back. And so after a while, we did eventually get married. He had 4 boys. I had Chapin and the daughter whom I had given up for adoption, who actually found me eventually. I'll tell you that in the other part of the story. But Bob's oldest son was married to a woman who got breast cancer, was very young, and it was very aggressive. And so she died. And then 10 years after that, Bob's son died of pancreatic cancer. And they left their granddaughter, or their daughter, my granddaughter, whom I adore, but she was left without parents. She had a stepmother who raised her the rest of the way. So Bob and I we actually had a wonderful life. We played tennis and golf, and we traveled all over the country. But then he got older, and 3 years ago, he died of a brain tumor. So that's the story. That's the story of loss. And for a long time, that was the way I looked at my life. But then 2 years ago, a year after Bob died, I went to a retreat for spiritual directors in Abiquiu, New Mexico. I'll go to anything that they offer in New Mexico. I actually was supposed to go to Santa Fe this past April, but we didn't get to do that, obviously. So one of the questions they asked at this retreat, it was called Journey Toward Wholeness. And one of the questions they asked was, what were the stepping stones that got you from where you are, or where you were, to where you are? And I sat with that question and wrote some things down and realized that I could look at my story in a completely different way if I looked at the stepping stones that got me to where I was. So this is another way to tell my story. And clearly this is just highlights because I don't want to take the whole time. I want to have time for you guys to talk about your stories. So after my father died, my mother joined the Unitarian Church in White Plains, New York. And so I was raised Unitarian all my childhood. I wanted something more spiritual. It was a very humanist congregation, very focused on social justice. And there was a year in Sunday school when we talked about the church across the street. We'd go visit other churches, and they were mostly Protestant. I don't think we even went to a Catholic church. We may have gone to a synagogue, but I wanted to convert to anything because they knew what they believed and because they had ritual and liturgy. And I loved I wanted incense and bells and candles. And our church was really spare and humanist and very, it's beautiful and wonderful in its way, and I appreciate it now. But I remember one time when I was in LRY, which was Liberal Religious Youth, we used to travel around the East Coast and go to conferences. And there was a conference in Philadelphia. And I remember sitting in this old church that had rafters, and I swear I felt God in the rafters, and I couldn't talk about it to anybody. It was not, I didn't have the words for it. We just didn't speak about God back in those days. So there was this yearning and this grounding in social justice that we had. Whitney Young, who is the head of the National Urban League, was a member of our church. And Dr. Collymore, who lived in our neighborhood, actually, who was a trustee of the UUA and had been president of our church and was African American. And so that thread, that stepping stone to doing social justice work carried with me into college. And the very first thing I did in college was volunteer for a program that was being run by a social worker in Roxbury, which is the Black section of Boston. And he believed that if he trained volunteers in what it was like to grow up Black in America, we would be better volunteers. So there was this small group of 6 of us that met every week for a year and read Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin and the history and talked about what it was like. And we went to voter registration drives, and we went knocking on doors to tell people to boycott Wonder Bread because they wouldn't hire African Americans. And we went to rallies, and I went to the March on Washington in 1963 and slept through Martin Luther King's speech, I'm afraid, but I've heard it. So, because we drove down overnight and I just couldn't stay awake. And so there was a huge amount of social activism. And that was a real stepping stone to what I did later on in life. But so I did have this baby in May of 1965. I had friends who either were going to Mississippi or had gone, and I didn't get to do that. But I did go back to college for the next year, and then went to Tanzania. I learned so much about what it meant to be an American, and so much about how little I knew about teaching. So when I came back and decided to go to graduate school, I went to get a master's in elementary school teaching in New York City. And we continued to, when I was in college and grad school, there were protests against the war. The war was the big thing that we were protesting then. My first husband I met because he was living in a co-op, and I had a job cooking for this co-op. There were 50 guys, and I would cook for them once a week, get this huge dinner on the table. My first husband was what we called dinner one. He was supposed to make salad and set the table and all that stuff. He spent the entire afternoon talking to me, and I should have known, but I didn't. But we talked about my being in Tanzania and his being in Guatemala for 2 years, because he was a conscientious objector and had gone to Guatemala with the American Friends Service Committee as his service as a conscientious objector. So right after we graduated, we went to Washington for the Poor People's Campaign, which is still being promoted by the Reverend Barber. I mean, it's still a thing. But we camped out on the mall in DC and then drove cross country with three other guys. One of them called himself General Wastmoreland. He did guerrilla theater in colleges about anti-war stuff. Another one had been a Nazi and then changed his mind, decided that he was really a radical. And the third one was also named Wesley, but for some reason he wanted to come with us. So we had two Wesleys, General Wastmoreland, George, and me. And we pushed a Toyota every time it had to start. Ended up in California. Wesley and I bought a car, went down to Mexico, stopped in Santa Fe to see some people that he had met hitchhiking. And I fell in love with Santa Fe. It was like instant love. And although Wesley and I were not doing so well at that point, I actually decided that instead of moving to Santa Fe, then I was going to go back to New York City and go to graduate school after all. So Wesley said he would drive me as far as Chicago because it was August of 1968 and the Democratic Convention was happening, and he wanted to be there. So we went to Chicago. I met up with a couple of women I'd been in Tanzania with. He got arrested the first night, but he was gone. I went back to New York, went to grad school. 3 weeks later, he moved in with us, me and my two roommates. I kicked him out after Christmas because reasons I don't need to tell you. But then back in the summer, just before I decided to move back to Santa Fe to go teach, he and I joined back up and we moved to Santa Fe together. And I was teaching at a small community school. It was kind of a countercultural thing, although all of Santa Fe, well, Santa Fe had wonderful threads. It had all of us hippies who had moved there from the coast pretty much. It had artists, it had Native Americans, and it had the Hispanic people who had lived there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we didn't always see eye to eye on things, but I loved Santa Fe. I felt so at home and connected there, and my spirituality was kind of fed because there were all these new age things that were available. I didn't go to church. I did one time speak at the Unitarian Church there because I was working for a small communally run home health agency. I was making $5 an hour and I was never going to make any more than that. And my son needed to go to college and I was a single mother. And I mean, he was only 10 then, but I knew he was smart. And so I thought that I had to get a job that would help him go through school. So I went to St. Louis, went to Washington University because I could have gotten a joint master's and a master's in social work and in business. And I hated being there so much that I opted just to do the business degree because I knew I'd get a job. And I did get a job, but I also, I felt like such a fish out of water in St. Louis. It was a really conservative community, and I was still very progressive in my political views, and I was a single mom, which was not common then. And so I started going to the Unitarian Church there because I knew that I would find people that I agreed with and that I connected with, and I did. And it was a godsend to have the UU Church. And it was mostly for the fellowship. It was not for any spiritual belief, but it really helped. And then I was working for Citigroup, and they transferred me to Rochester because they had the Upstate Bank here and they needed a financial planner. And so I moved here and went to First Unitarian first thing because I knew that that was how I would find people that I liked and that I could talk to. One day, so I moved here in June of 44. I probably didn't start going to church until the fall of 44. Maybe a year after I started going to church, there was a service, and I remember it was set up in the round, and we turned around to shake hands. You know how you shake hands in the time of greeting, and there was this man with a beard and a twinkle in his eye, and we shook hands, and then after the service, he found me again and we talked and talked and talked. And after the next service, we talked and talked and talked. And of course, it was Bob. Zella Moore takes credit for having, and I don't know if any of you remember Zella. She was around for years and years and died a couple of years ago. But she takes credit. She said Bob came up to her and said, "Who's that girl over there?" And she told him or introduced us or something. But anyway, so we got married in May of '89. And church continued to be an incredibly important part of both our lives. I was on the board and president for a year and on every committee you could be on. And Bob was there and started, got the Bi-Fry guys connected, and we just really were settled in and happy in this spiritual home. In 2001, my daughter found me, and because the internet was up and running then, I had made myself available on a website called adoption.com. And I had signed papers that said I would never look for her, but I could make myself available. And so I put in all the information I had on adoption.com. And Annie said one day, she was just sort of fooling around. A friend of hers had found an old friend on the internet, and she typed in her birth date and she said, poof, there you were. And so she called the clearinghouse people, and they called me, and they put us together, and it was the most unbelievable thing because it just filled this hole in my heart. I remember standing up in church and talking about it in joys and sorrows when we still did that, and so many people came to tell me their own experiences with adoption, either with having been adopted or having given someone up. But so Annie is still an incredibly close-in part of my life. I mean, she has been wrapped by my whole family and my son, and it's as though those first 35 years she was still connected with us. So Annie filled that hole, the black hole that had been left by her adoption. But the other the other part was that I was really noticing a yearning for something deeper spiritually, that I loved our church, I loved the people, I loved the intellectual stimulation, and I wanted something deeper. And when Jen Crow started Wellspring, which was in the fall of 2005, I said, absolutely, yes, I'd love to do that. And it was such a relief to me to have a place to talk about all these spiritual questions that I hadn't really found a place to talk about. And I had a spiritual director. I still have a spiritual director, but I've been through 3 or 4 since then. I started spiritual practice, which I had never done intentionally, and it just changed my life. And then I started facilitating Wellspring, and we developed more programs, and that became the work that really mattered to me. So I went to seminary, and I'm an ordained interfaith minister. And then I went on to spiritual counseling training, because what I really wanted to do is spiritual counseling. And so I still do that, and I love being an interfaith minister. I mean, it's always amazing to me the times when it comes, when I don't expect that particular part of me to come up, but it does. And so even, Bob died 3 months ago, but, and it broke my heart, obviously. And what I feel most for him is gratitude that he made it possible for me to live this life that is such a gift. And that's the other story, the stepping stone story. So I also, I could tell you my story through the places I've lived, because I've lived in a gazillion different places, including all 11 houses I lived in New Mexico. I could tell you my story through the people I've loved. I could tell you the story of my life through music, like starting with Sydney in 8th grade, and our song was All I Have to Do Is Dream by the Everly Brothers. Do anybody remember that one? I can still sing every word. I could tell you my story through the jobs I've had, but you'll notice that the jobs were really insignificant to me in the long. I know that's not true for many of you, but for me, the jobs were the least important part. So I'm going to unmute. Well, actually, I'm going to unmute you all and ask you this question, but take turns talking, okay? So think about what's been happening in the last 3 months, which is the lockdown, and think about what is the story that you tell about this lockdown. I mean, we're going to narrow it to, I don't want you to think about your whole lives, because I hope all of you